It is a great pleasure to welcome you here to the Center for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing. I have the great privilege of welcoming our most distinguished speaker, Shamil Chandaria, who some of you will already know, some of you will have heard either live or on his many talks in the ether. I was going to make some joke, given that this is an AI-generated image, saying that this is really an AI-generated version of Shamil. But I think the AI is not quite there, because what you'll find here is that Shamil is really one of a kind. He's a polymath who spans many things. If you ask him, he will tell you he's really a philosopher, but he also speaks very fluently about neuroscience, about AI. And he's a great cook. I can testify to this, which of course is really the key to human flourishing. So in many ways, it's always truly exciting to be able to welcome you and hear about your latest ideas. And I think this one, though, is really quite special. It's about without giving too much away, it's about the fivefold ways. But we'll learn a lot more about that. Please allow me, again, let's welcome Shamil and let's have a great ride.
Thank you, Morten. And again, I say this every time, but I really mean it, which is that this seminar series is so important because you give people time to slowly express the ideas, and that really helps the pedagogy of the whole thing. So I'm very grateful. So we're going to talk today about consciousness. What is the critical level of description for consciousness? And with special reference to the implications for the possibility of conscious artificial intelligence. So let's get into it. It's going to be quite a long and varied talk, but just relax and it'll all start making sense. But we're going to start with some confusion. What does consciousness depend upon? And what we're going to go through is a whole series of answers, and it's going to be a confusing cacophony of answers. So, what does consciousness depend on? Well, the traditional answer is that consciousness depends on the existence of some immaterial soul or spirit, some sort of ghost in the machine. And this is termed dualism or substance dualism. And of course, it's the common sense view. And it's often contrasted with physicalism, where the idea is that consciousness depends only on the physical brain and on neural processes. Another idea is that consciousness is, in fact, doesn't depend on anything. It's ontologically fundamental. And there are various forms of this idea. The first is that consciousness is a fundamental property of the physical substrate. It's part of the fabric of physics, and that would be some sort of panpsychism. Another idea is that, in fact, consciousness is all there is. The physical is, in fact, an illusion, and that's called idealism. Another idea is that neither consciousness and the physical are two aspects of a deeper underlying neutral reality, ultimate reality, and that is called neutral monism, or sometimes dual aspect monism. Another idea is that consciousness emerges when there is a sufficient threshold of complexity in a physical system, but it emerges in a radically strong way, in a radically emergent way, which is not predictable or explicable from the physical system itself. So that's called strong emergentism. Another idea is that consciousness depends on specific functional processes or patterns of information processing, computations, and they're irrespective of the physical substrate on which they're realized. So these computations can happen on any substrate. And that is the idea of computational functionalism, which we'll talk about a lot in this talk. And examples of theories of consciousness which actually kind of are compatible with computational functionalism are global workspace theory, which is the idea that consciousness arises when information is broadcast to a global workspace, allowing for widespread integration and sharing of information so that subsystems can use it efficiently. Another idea that is compatible with computational functionalism is higher order thought theory, which is that consciousness arises when an informational structure, which means effectively a representation, is the object of a higher order informational structure, a meta-representation. And that there is a knowing or awareness of having this representation. That's varieties of higher order thought theory. Another idea is that consciousness emerges when there are recurrent reentrant feedback loops in neural processing, when the neural processes actually feed back upon themselves. That's recurrent processing theory. Another idea is that consciousness emerges when the brain has an internal model of what it's attending to, which helps you predict and control this attending process called attention. This is attention schema theory. And another idea is that actually consciousness is entirely an illusory concept. It arises as part of a simulated world model and includes the model, and this model has a knowing of what it knows. So there are different varieties of this. This is essentially some sort of illusionism, that consciousness is some sort of magic trick. Now, another idea altogether about what consciousness depends upon is the idea that consciousness emerges when there is a system that has an integrated cause-effect informational structure upon itself that is intrinsic, specific, irreducible, and definite. And this is an idea called integrated information theory, which we'll also talk about quite a bit. And unpack some of those words, so don't worry about it. Another idea altogether is that consciousness depends intimately on life processes, being a system for itself, continuing to exist, resisting the second law of thermodynamics, which is pushing us towards entropy, resisting the second law of thermodynamics through corrective homeostatic action, or in general, allostasis. Using ideas like active inference, in other words, that's how it does the allostasis, by using active inference. And these are the features that actually underlie subjective experience. So consciousness can be seen as an intrinsic characteristic of living systems. So these kind of ideas would be biopsychism or the beast machine theory of Anil Seth, who is in the audience today. Another related idea is, but going even deeper, is that consciousness is a real natural biological phenomenon that emerges from biological systems and actually requires things like living neural tissue and couldn't be realized on any different kind of substrate. That could be called biological naturalism. This is another idea which is called the beautiful loop predictive processing theory, which I wrote together with a collaborator, Ruben Lakonin, which is the idea that consciousness arises when a system engages in active inference or predictive processing, and it generates a world model of itself and the environment, that reflexively feeds back onto itself so that the world model knows itself. So that's the beautiful loop theory. Another idea, altogether completely different, is that consciousness arises from quantum processes in the brain, specifically, for example, in microtubules, which are these little tiny molecular structures within neurons, actually within all cells, in fact. They give structure to the cells. Famously, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have proposed this. It's called orchestrated objective reduction theory. Another idea is that molecular and chemical properties based on carbon chemistry are uniquely suited for the emergence of consciousness, and that you really can't have it otherwise. That's sometimes called carbon chauvinism. And then now quite an influential theory now, which is based on the idea that actually that's
okay. I found this on the web for another idea altogether completely different, is that consciousness is
okay, stop.
For example, in microtubules, which are these little tiny molecular structures within neurons. Actually, within all cells, in fact, they give structure to the cells, and a famous...
I didn't even know I must have had an update of Apple Intelligence. Right.
This shows us it's the real Shamil.
Okay, so the idea is let's not focus so much just on this, on the brain, or even the body. Consciousness requires a physical body which actually interacts with the environment. It's this body-environment system so consciousness emerges when there's an interaction of the body-brain system with an environment through sensory motor systems. And these are embodied cognition theories based on 4E cognition and others. And then finally, we have consciousness arising from the intricate electromagnetic fields that are generated by the brain. And this might sound really wild and out there, but actually it's got, really interesting idea that oh, well, the global workspace is the electromagnetic field. And it also seems to explain, is compatible with the idea why the cerebellum isn't conscious, because the kind of cerebellum is too wrapped up on itself to produce the right type of electromagnetic field. And the electromagnetic field might have downward causation back onto the neurons. So lots of ideas. You might think, well, most of them are crazy, but we have a cacophony of confusing answers. So how do we sort this out? How do we get more clarity? Okay, so that was designed to sort of show you this wild landscape, but really we need to get clarity. And this talk is going to be about how to comb through, create distinctions and taxonomies and levels of description, which will help us situate all the thinking that's going on in the field. So the first distinction is that out of all those theories of consciousness, they kind of broadly fit into two categories. One were kind of metaphysically oriented, metaphysical theories of consciousness, like idealism, like dualism, neutral monism, panpsychism, fundamental property dualism, substance dualism. And the others section were scientific theories of consciousness. And this is a little review of scientific theories of consciousness. Anil Seth and Tim Bain produced a couple of years ago, which give some of the theories that we talked about there. And that's kind of interesting. So already we see this broad categorization, but is that helpful? Is it helpful to make that distinction? I mean, does it help the idea of figuring out what's going on? This distinction about consciousness as such versus the experience contents of consciousness. So let's drill down on that a bit. So the first example is like consciousness as such is subjective experience itself versus the phenomenal character of what we're actually aware of. So the fact that we're aware of this redness here. On the first category, again, on the one hand, we have that which makes anything feel like something at all. Okay, this is a very, very deep and important question, but it's a different question from what a particular experience feels like. Like, you know, the experience of drinking water feels very different from the experience of eating sand. Another distinction in the same vein is from the Indian tradition of Advaita Vedanta, and that is the distinction between the knower of an experience and the experience of the known, that you know, that I'm drinking water, versus that there is someone who knows that, or something. Thomas Metzinger puts it in a slightly different way. This is my interpretation of what he's saying. He talks about a minimal phenomenal experience or a pure awareness experience, the epistemic space itself, which is the space that knows, versus experienced representations. So what's in the content of that epistemic space? What is actually known versus the space of knowingness? If you like global workspace theory, then the distinction could be slightly passed like this. Not exactly, but close, which is the global workspace itself versus representations within the global workspace. If you like IIT, you might think about the maximal phi complex itself versus particular activation patterns within the maximal phi complex. Another one would be, for example, if you like predictive processing, is the space of the generative model itself versus the output or contents of the generative model. If you like higher order thought theory, you might express this distinction as the higher order awareness itself versus the contents or representations of that which is represented. In other words, the actual meta representations themselves. One that I particularly like is by Michael Graziano, which is, he just calls this M consciousness and I consciousness. He recognizes that these two terms. And actually, I think he uses the M consciousness because I think he's probably an illusionist. He says M consciousness is for mysterious consciousness, and I consciousness is for the information consciousness or informational content consciousness, something like that. And then another way to parse it is really the distinction between Chalmers' hard problem and Anil Seth's real problem. So the first category, consciousness as such, is really the subject of the hard problem. And the second, the experience contents, the phenomenal character of what we're aware of, is the real problem. And the real problem is then we can use that to explain, predict, and control the experience contents of consciousness. And so this pure space of subjective experience awareness itself has no informational content, whereas the experience contents of consciousness has a phenomenal character that actually bears information. You know, I experience heads or tails. That's one bit of information. So, you know, it's got experiential content, whereas pure awareness itself, if there are no distinctions to be made within pure awareness, then there is no distinctions means no information. So, and then similar to that is no information processing going on versus I consciousness requiring information processing. So we have this key distinction between M consciousness and I consciousness. So on the one hand, this M consciousness we can associate with the answer to what these metaphysical theories ontological theories of consciousness are trying to get towards. Idealism, dualism, panpsychism, etc. They're trying to understand what is the nature of consciousness? How does it fit into our picture of reality? What is the ultimate nature of ontological status of consciousness? And then I consciousness is a theory of what information processing and or what transformations of the physical substrate of a system are associated with having a particular experience. So that's a very different question, but very important. Now, here's the good news. If we want to understand the ultimate nature of reality, then we need these kind of questions and these metaphysical theories. And believe me, this is something I'm very, very interested in, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I discuss and have had various podcasts on this discussion, but this is not the subject of today's talk, because what we're interested in today's talk is whether AI could become conscious. And what that means is what type of information processing or transformations of the physical substrate of the system are associated with having a particular rich, content-full experience. And that's why we're going to be focusing on I consciousness today. So I'm not dissing, like maybe Graziano, M consciousness. Believe me, I think it's very important. This could be me sitting here, but this is what we're talking about today. So that's very important, and is going to allow us to simplify things further. So let's look at this question. What are the information processing or transformations of the physical substrate that is associated with having a particular experience? Well, in 1976, David Marr proposed 3 levels of analysis of information processing systems. This is a really nice photograph which I unearthed with David Marr and Francis Crick and Tommaso Poggio, who he wrote this paper with. And I think Tommaso Poggio was Demis Hassabis's postdoc supervisor. And Marr essentially proposed these 3 levels of analysis of information processing system. The first level is the computational level. What does an information processing system do? What are the goals of the information processing system? What is the input-output behavior of the system? Essentially, this function here, this is this computational level. The second level is this algorithmic level. What is the system? How does the system do what it does? What kind of representations, processes, and algorithms does it employ? And the third level is the implementation level. How is the system physically realized? What are the representations and algorithms? On what sort of substrate are these instantiated, these algorithms? So this first level in Marr's level, the computational level, is kind of associated with a behaviorism. We're just interested in the input-output system. So if we're thinking about consciousness, and we think that this is the critical level for consciousness, you need a kind of a behavioral test. Now, many of you know the Turing test. That was for intelligence, not consciousness. Very important. But you can imagine a kind of a consciousness Turing test. And in fact, there's a particular variation of that from the movie Ex Machina called the Garland test, which is essentially a consciousness Turing test with this extra caveat that you actually know that it's an AI, and then do you still think it's conscious? And there's also, I guess, a modern day sort of neo-Wittgensteinianism, where it's all about how does the system behave? You are the use of your language and your behavior. So The second level of Mars, 3 levels of information processing, is this algorithmic level. And that's associated with computational functionalism. Now, you're going to think, well, why is computational here, whereas computational is on the first level? Mars just called this computational level. I mean, it might just be called something else, a behavioral level. But this is the idea that it's at that level that computations are going on. So theories that use this level to think about consciousness would be things like higher order thought theory or global workspace theory, even some forms of predictive processing theory. But we're not quite sure about local recurrence theory, probably, but it's got these feedback loops which we need to think about. And, you know, are they really algorithmic, or do they really need to be hardwired feedback systems? Certainly, as I'll come to, integrated information theory actually doesn't seem to neatly fall under this category at all. And I'll put a question mark over the beautiful loop theory. And then finally, this implementation level, well, there are theories like the electromagnetic field theory or the quantum orchestrated objective reduction theory. But then what about things like biopsychism and the beast machine theory? This also seems to not quite fit. I mean, seems to require a particular substrate, but they're really talking about processes or a kind of functionalism, just not computational functionalism. So we'll come back. So Mars 3 levels have been very influential, very interesting, very useful, but they're kind of a little not fine-grained enough and not principled enough to really differentiate what's going on with theories of consciousness. So we're going to look at levels in detail. And now we're going to go through some philosophical concepts. The first one is emergence. And emergence really probably starts off with Aristotle, who basically had this idea that the whole is somehow greater than the sum of its parts. So let's take a molecule of water. Okay, an actual molecule of water is not wet. It's just this vibrating whatever it is, but it's certainly not wet. But if you put a lot of them together, you get water, and that has the property of wetness, interestingly. And so how does this happen? This is some sort of emergent property. Wetness is an emergent property of H2O molecules. And in fact, we even know how it happens. It happens to do with, you know, macroscopic hydrogen bonding. But this is the idea of emergence, how properties emerge at a macroscopic level, which aren't actually there at a microscopic level. And the world is full of emergence. So the whole of the special sciences emerges from fundamental physics, you know, from statistical mechanics, classical physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, social sciences. And we might even think that we get these novel ontological categories emerging. From the material world, we get life. From life, we get mind. From mind, we get culture. I don't know, maybe. So the key concept to think about emergence, one of the key concepts, is something called coarse graining, which is the idea of a many-to-one mapping. So if we have different levels of description, a coarse graining is when we get, oh, do you see this animation, right? When we get a many-to-one mapping, so that each element of a macroscopic layer is associated with many levels in the layer below. And so you can imagine a system with a whole load of micromechanisms, a system with a series of micromechanisms. And if we coarse grain those into, for example, 3 macroscopic states, we get this coarse graining. And then, of course, if any one of these mechanisms that activates within the top box, will get macro system 1 activating. The next idea, which we really need to drill down on to make progress, is the idea of supervenience. And supervenience is a concept that's used in philosophy quite a lot, but it's not necessarily well understood outside philosophy. So supervenience, the definition of supervenience is something like this, that A supervenes on B, A supervenes on B, where A is called the supervenient and B is called the subvenient, if and only if, when there is some change or difference in A, there must have been some change or difference in B. So that's a bit abstract. Let's give an example. For example, if mental states supervene on physical states, then there can only have been a change in the mental state if there has been a change in the physical state. Okay, so here we have some mental states and a physical state, and this mental state is associated with this physical state, it supervenes on it. And there can only be a change in the mental state from M1 to M2 if the physical system has changed as well. You couldn't have a change in the mind without there being any change in the physical states. Now, more technically, and I'm not gonna go through all this logic here, but it's kind of important. I'm gonna just lay it out, just read there, which is that A properties supervene on B properties if and only if all things that are B indiscernible are A indiscernible. And being indiscernible means sharing all properties. So that's a bit of a mouthful. Let's use an example to explain it. Very simple. The mental supervenes on the physical if and only if, or that's the same thing as, two systems are physically indiscernible, then they are mentally indiscernible. So that's the key thing. Two systems that are physically indiscernible, then it must be that they're mentally indiscernible if the mental supervenes on the physical. Okay, so that's very important. I took time because if we don't get this concept, it's going to be very difficult to follow the talk. So now what's the relationship between coarse graining and supervenience? Okay, so here we have a sort of system of layers, for example, particles and quantum fields, and atoms supervene on that layer, that sort of a different level of description, and molecules supervene on atoms, and cells supervene on molecules, and organisms supervene on cells. Okay, what we can see is that this supervenience happens because there is a coarse graining. So what we can have is that when we get coarse-grained descriptions, they supervene on each other. And this is very important. So we're going to have because we're going to be using coarse graining to establish a supervenience order. All right. So why do we do all that? Why not just stick to the lowest level? I mean, you know, why make life complicated? It's just like, it's all quantum fields. Shut up and let's not talk any further. Are higher levels important? Do they carry explanatory power? Do they carry causal power? The higher levels actually carry causal power rather than just the lower levels. And what does this have to do with consciousness? Okay. Well, to talk about this, we're going to need to talk about something very important called macrocausation. So again, we have a system here. For example, you can think of this as a microphysical system, and this is some sort of macroscopic coarse graining of this microphysical system. And this macro system supervenes on this microphysical system. Now we know through the laws of physics there are microcausations that happen where the microphysical system will transform to some other microphysical configuration through causes. The question is, are there macro causes? If we've said, look, the laws of physics are complete, I don't want any more causes. I mean, I don't want causes outside we'll have physics and then we'll have some ghosts. Well, that's not good, but are there macro causes? So this is very important. We need to think about this. Are we assuming that there are ghosts if we have macro causes? Let me give you an example. This is an example, it goes under the name of, in philosophy, something called mental causation. So I'm physically fully determined through my molecular reactions that are going on. And yet I have some thoughts. And one of the thoughts is, I'm hungry. And if there's a sandwich shop on the other side of the road, and if I cross the road, I will achieve my, I'll fulfill my desires. Now, that's a kind of a macroscopic, coarse-grained description of what's going on. But do we want to say that the thought that there is that I have a belief that there's a sandwich shop on the other side of the road and then I have a desire for food is not the cause of my action? Do I want to say that it's only physically micro-determined? We'll see. We'll see whether such macro causes in fact arise. And to do that, we're going to have to get into the weeds about causation. You'll be amazed to know that we're really going to have to think about what is causation. So this idea of causation really has been around for, a few hundred years, since David Hume, at least. But probably one of the best ideas of causation came in the 1970s with David Lewis, who really put together a counterfactual theory of causation using something called modal logic. And that basically says that, look, A causes B if and only if A were to occur, then B would occur. And if A were not to occur, then B would not occur. So for example, we could have a match striking and then some fire. Now that's just, okay, so we got this correlation between a strike of a match and some fire. But does the striking of the match cause the fire? And to determine that, what we would need is to actually strike the match and see if the fire arises, and to not strike the match and see if the fire does not arise. And so this is the key insight. And in fact, this is the insight behind all interventional trials in modern medicine, randomized controlled trials, which is that we need to intervene. To move away from causation to correlation, we actually need to intervene. And this was made rigorous by about 20, 25 years ago by Judea Pearl using something called the do calculus. And essentially what that really means is that we actually need to mutate and intervene in our model and actually physically change the model. To figure out if the light switch causes the room light to go on, we need to do a trial. Push the light switch up, see what happens, push the light switch down, see what happens. So we need to intervene in our models, not just look at correlations. So the basic idea, this is obviously a little detailed, but the basic idea is that there are many ways to push this causal idea, but one of the simplest ideas is that, okay, let's look at a system and, it's consisting of a series of light switches, for example, and let's actually turn on these light switches one at a time, right? With equal probability. So we do that. It's called the maximum entropy distribution. And let's see what effect it has on the lighting in the house, for example. Where does it do? What's the effect of this? So we causally, we do something and we figure out the causes. And roughly speaking, just so you have this basic idea, the effective causal information is the mutual information between this intervened distribution and the effect distribution. Okay, so there are many. This is one idea, but there are many ways of thinking about this mutual information between past and future, between cause and effect. So this is one idea. First, to think about the fact that there can be macroscopic causes. Here we have a very simple microphysical system. Okay, these are binary units, which can be 1 or 0, and they're connected to each other, and they have this kind of law in which see how they change. And this law can be fully understood as being encapsulated in this transition probability matrix. Now, you can figure out all of the causal impact, all of the causal information, this effective information for the microphysical system. And it turns out that this effective information has 2.43 bits of information. But if we coarse grain the system in a very interesting way, if we coarse grain it, saying, well, these are kind of two, let's call these 2 units just one system, and let's call these 2 units one system, we get a simplified probability transition matrix. And here's the magical thing. It turns out that there is more causal information in the macroscopic system than there is in the micro. So this is the sort of proof of principle that, in fact, macro systems can have more causal information than micros. This is very important. I'm not advocating this particular measure because people in this room have come up with much better measures. So this is work done by Fernando Rosas and Pedro Mediano and others, and Anil Sess on this paper. And they used more sophisticated information theoretic systems using phi-ID to do exactly this kind of thing. And again, they find this amazing thing where if you have some sort of macroscopic coarse graining of some underlying microphysical situation, and that the temporal evolution is entirely governed by the microphysical layer, you can still get more causal emergence, and in fact some downward causation as well. So this is a classic example. This is Conway's game of life, where every pixel is just determined by a series of microphysical local rules. And yet we always get these, I don't know, I always used to love to play with this, many years ago, playing with these gliders, banging into spaceships and ending up and seeing what happens. And there are these patterns that persist through time. And they find that, in fact, there is more information in the macroscopic layer, causal information in the macroscopic layer than in the microscopic layer. And there is this causal information. Another metric, which is used by IIT, Information Integration Theory, it's effectively the similar type of idea. These are all different variations. Everyone's going to say mine's the best, but these are all out there. I'm not making any votes here, but again, this is the idea of cause-effective information. I'm using this example for an older version of IIT version 3, but it basically gives the idea, if you have a microscopic system with binary units that are connected with a certain law, this is an AND gate, an XOR gate, an OR gate, and we see what happens from the past to the present and from the present to the future, we can effectively figure out from the past to the present some cause information in exactly the same way as effectively like that effective information. And we can also figure out an effect information. So we go from the past to the present, and we can get some sort of cause information, some causal macroscopic information, and some some effective information, and then you can define something which is the minimum of that, which is a cause-effect information. So this is basically giving you an idea that these systems can have a cause-effect power over determining them. Now, again, using IIT, they use exactly the same thing. This is coarse-grained emergence. They, again, find that this integrated information phi measure gives you an estimate of the macroscopic cause-effect power over the macroscopic system compared to the microscopic. But let's make this a bit more precise. So we have a particular microscopic system full of units, and there are many ways to coarse grain. So, for example, this is one way to coarse grain it. You can combine these neurons, and then you can combine these, and then you can combine these. Now, if we were to do this is only illustrative, of course. If we were to do this and figure out the causal information for every single type of coarse graining, something one actually can't do in practice very easily, you might find that the intrinsic cause-effect power somewhere between very, very coarse-grained and somewhere between super micro, somewhere in the middle, you might get a peak, a maximum of cause-effect power. And that would be a level of causal emergence. If this is the full microphysical level, there's some sort of extra causal cause-effect power. And that cause-effect power that peak might correspond to, for example, this particular coarse graining. And that coarse graining will have will be the maximal phi complex, roughly speaking, in integrated information theory. So I've just kind of simplified what's going on in integrated information theory. Essentially, the idea is that integrated information theory picks out one particular coarse graining scheme that has the maximum cause-effect power. But it's a bit more complicated than that. And this is a very quick scheme. I need to keep going. So integrated information theory is basically the idea that consciousness is identical to the cause-effect structure of a physical substrate that specifies an irreducible amount of integrated information. So how does it work? IIT starts from pure consciousness, from just conscious experience, and identifies certain phenomenological properties of that conscious experience. For example, it has intrinsic experience. The substrate of consciousness must have intrinsic cause-effect power. That's how we get different representations. So this and a whole lot of others. It must be composed. It has, there's a sort of structure in our experience. The table is on the floor. The glass is on the table. It's integrated. We have this one experience. From these phenomenological properties, they figure out what must be true about the computational layer of what's going on, and from there, you unfold a particular cause-effect structure. So you see what's going on, and then you unfold exactly what is affecting what in terms of cause-effect. And it is this cause-effect structure, sometimes called a phi structure, that is identified with the conscious experience itself. And any actual neural correlates of consciousness are simply a correlation. So that's how IIT works. Should we open the window a bit? Just get some fresh air. Okay. So that was the hard work. I promise you, we've done a lot of the hard work. Okay, so we're going to go. Now, the next thing we need to think about is computational functionalism. Computational functionalism is, in fact, a kind of a theory and philosophy of mind that says, this is functionalism, that says that mental states are defined by their functional role within a system, i.e. how they causally interact with the sensory inputs, the behavioral outputs, and other mental states. So mental states are abstract roles or processes. They're not tied to the physical implementation or physical instantiation. And computational functionalism is a specific version of functionalism, which is that taking the idea that the mind kind of operates like a computer, where mental states are computational states defined by their computational functions within the brain. So in other words, their role in information processing. So as I said, there are all these theories that are compatible. I won't go through them now because we need to move on, but we've talked about global workspace. We talked about higher order thought theory. catch up on things. I want to start, stop there, actually spend time with one of them, which is predictive processing theory, because I think it's particularly important, probably because I'm kind of an advocate of this framework. And that is that that takes a sort of slightly different view from some of the other theories. And it says, look, we really need to start to think of how the human and the human mind and the human brain makes sense of its sensory data, which is coming from its environment. How would the mind create a kind of picture of what's going on in the world? And the idea is that from a purely information processing theory, there is an exact answer to that, which is it has to do Bayesian inference. Now, of course, Bayesian inference is not possible in general. It's very difficult, computationally explosive. So we think that the human brain is doing an approximate Bayesian inference. And how does that work? Well, we get some sensory data, and we have priors that we've learned through time, through our evolution and through our upbringing, that, so for example, the sensory data might be seeing a face, but we have some priors around what faces look like, high-level abstract representations of faces. And from these priors, we generate what we would expect to see. But of course, we get this noisy sensory data, and there could be differences between what we generate and what we actually see. And so we get prediction errors, and that then are fed up the model, and we get a slight shift in, the exact generative model until we settle on a posterior, a bound percept, which is the actual perception of the face. Now, this is the key thing behind any kind of theory of predictive processing theory of consciousness, which is that what we perceive, what we're conscious of, is only the posterior, only this final face. We are not conscious of the sensory data, neither are we conscious of our priors. And this, you might say, well, where do these priors come from? Well, they come from models higher up in the hierarchy, and the priors for those models come from higher up there. And prediction errors flow up back the other way. And so we get this kind of hierarchical predictive processing architecture. Now, so we have this picture of how the brain works. So I think this is actually one of the best models of actually how the brain really works, which is we have these series of models which are initially a kind of a unimodal processing, so visual models and audition and olfaction, smell and taste and somatosensory. And then eventually these models start cross-talking and you get this multimodal integration. And of course, it's all driven by these high-level priors up here. Now, the basic idea in this computational view is that it gives us a bridge between the brain, the third-person perspective, and our phenomenology, our actual conscious experience. And this bridge is very helpful because it can help to somehow bridge the explanatory gap. We won't get to this explanatory gap between our first-person perspective and the third-person brain, but actually bypassing this explanatory gap by going via a computational view, we can start to bridge it. Now, the important thing here is this can't be really a theory of consciousness, because not all of the output of the generative model actually make it into consciousness. There's lots and lots of things that are being generated by the brain, but actually never gets into our conscious awareness. So how does this happen? Well, last year we proposed a theory of how this might happen. And what we said is that essentially there's some sort of inferential competition between the output of these models that go through some sort of competition to get into a global posterior, a world model. And the way that these things get into the world model is by cohering with the world model, by cohering with themselves and being strong, or having a lot of precision weighting associated with them, which is something like attention. Now, the key thing is, in terms of consciousness, is this what we're conscious of, and how? The idea is that the world model must feed back onto the abstraction hierarchy so that we have this loop, so that the world model ultimately becomes aware of itself. And this is that kind of reflexive awareness property, the same reflexivity that's in there in the recurrent processing theory, the same reflexivity that we saw in integrated information theory. In fact, the same reflexivity that's really there in global workspace theory when the workspace rebroadcasts to all the subunits. But how does this feedback work? Well, actually, we don't fully know, but we have some ideas, and we can express this in predictive processing terms. But what I'm actually going to do is break the mold a bit and actually say, well, maybe it's actually something else, which is that if we re-express these feedback loops, that feedback in terms of these neural areas that are connecting to each other, then we get some sort of macroscopic system which has integrated information. And therefore, this unfolded phi structure, this unfolded cause-effect structure, in fact, is what the phenomenal generative world model is. So this is just a proposal to say that perhaps the looping of the generative phenomenal world model is operationalized by intrinsic integrated cause-effect structure. And so that just putting that. Now, this is very important. So we've looked at computational functional theories. We've looked at integrated information theory. The question is, what is the difference between this cause-effect structure and the computational view? They kind of sound like computation, so are they the same thing? And what we'll show here is that, in fact, they are not. That a computational functional description of a system does not imply a unique cause-effect structure. And this is absolutely pivotal. So we can prove this by an example. So if we have a system here, PQRS, and these are binary units, and they have a kind of truth table to say if you've got these binary units PQRS at one time, this is this is what will happen to them at the next period of time. So there's a kind of law associated with that. And of course, that instantiates a probability transition matrix. And you can fully unfold the cause-effect structure in the way of IIT and figure out all the cause-effect mechanisms and relations and distinctions. And you will find that this particular system has a phi, capital Phi, of 391 bits, okay? So this is a kind of a structure with a positive cause-effect structure, with some real cause-effect power over itself. And what it means is that this macroscopic system has cause-effect power over itself, not just the microphysical units, but the whole has cause-effect power over the whole in the future. Now, instead of using that particular system here that we showed, this one, let's actually simulate that in a purely feed-forward manner. Okay, so if we simulate this on a purely feed-forward manner, it's a lot more complicated. We can do that using these 16 units, and there's like there's over 130 units that are involved in simulating it. So it's a lot more complicated to simulate that system. But here's the thing: it gives you exactly the same output as the PQRS. So this dashed system gives you exactly the same output as the original system. So it is computationally functionally equivalent. But whilst it's computationally functionally equivalent, it is not, it does not have the same cause-effect structure. So this simulation structure actually has no integrated information. It's purely feed-forward modules. There's 0.5 bits of cause-effect information in there. And yet it's exactly computationally equivalent. And it's nothing, and this is just a little side note, that it's not just the fact that it has, you can actually put feedback connections and still you'll have 0.5. So here's the takeaway message. A computational functional description does not imply a unique cause-effect structure. It can be operationalized by many cause-effect structures. So if IIT is correct, then some structures may be conscious and others not conscious, and yet they would still have the same computational functional description. Okay, so that's the grounding of. Now we'll come to the real theory, the critical level theory that we're now going to discuss this levels. So that was a lot of grounding into, let's just remember, causality, cause-effect structure, supervenience, coarse graining. And we will now come to how could AI be conscious? So the key argument that we're going to use is something that's very obvious, which is if we have the first premise of this argument is that the contents of conscious experience supervene on microphysical properties. In other words, mental states supervene on mind states. Okay, so that's pretty uncontroversial unless you're a dualist. The second premise is that system A is conscious. So we assume that we humans are conscious. Okay. The third premise, very trivial, is that system B is an exact replica of system A. In other words, this is equivalent to, it had a complete microphysical description of system B is indiscernible from system A. And the conclusion is system B is conscious. Okay, so that's the grounding which we're gonna build this system, this whole explanation on. Now you might say, well, that's kind of obvious. Like obviously, if system A is conscious and it's indiscernible from system B and it's got exactly the same microphysical description, then obviously system B is conscious. Good. But now, if system B is an AI, well, then clearly the AI is not indiscernible at a microphysical level. But, so we don't know if system B is conscious. But if one of the coarse grained descriptions that we have up here, let's say level 2, is the computational functional description. So we know that the computational functional description ultimately supervenes on the microphysical description. So this is a description of a human being as a fully computational functional description, and it supervenes on the microphysical description. And suppose, for the sake of the argument, that the computational functional description of the human, system A, and system B, the AI, were to be indiscernible, then, and also if computational functionalism is true, in other words, the critical level for consciousness is this second level, Okay, so this is if we assume that the critical level for consciousness is the second level, in other words, if computational functionalism is true, then we can conclude that system B is conscious. Okay. Now, let's look at something that's even more coarse-grained, which is right at the top, which is the input-output black box description. So this is at the level of pure behaviorism. We don't know what's inside the system. All we know is the inputs and the outputs. And let's say, for the sake of the argument, that the artificial intelligence system has exactly the same input-output behavioral description as the system A. In other words, they are undiscernible. Then we could say that system B, the AI, is conscious. Okay. Similarly, if we look at the third level, now the third level, we're going to have something that's that's less coarse-grained. So we're going to have something that's coarse-grained on the microphysical level, but something below the computational functional description. In other words, there's a many-to-one mapping between the cause-effect structure and the computational level. So the computational functional description supervenes on the cause-effect structure. And let's suppose that the AI has exactly an indiscernible cause-effect structure description to the human system, then the AI would be conscious. Now, notice one thing. If you're indiscernible at level 1, 2, 3, level 3, then you're also indiscernible at level 4 and level 5. In other words, you will also have exactly the same behavioral outputs, and you'll also have the same computational functional description. Now, the second layer, just the layer below that, is even less coarse-grained. So this is not just looking at the cause-effect structure in the brain. This is looking at the full causal embodied life processes. So this is the full causal structure of life processes. So this is quite a detailed description, but notice it's still just the processes. It's not the full microphysical description. We haven't specified that it's made of carbon, for example. And if we look at that full causal embodied life processes level, and that's indiscernible from an AI, then the AI is conscious. And finally, you have, well, the microphysical thing, which we talked about, can't happen. Now, you might say, well, that's not very helpful because, look, indiscernible, that's very difficult. That's not really going to happen. Indiscernible means sharing all properties. That's really strong equivalence. What happens if we have a kind of a weaker equivalence? And this is sort of justified by the theories of consciousness that we talked about, because they don't say that everything has to be the same. They specify certain pivotal properties that have to be the same. For example, that there's a global workspace, or that there's an attention schema, or that, for example, there's a particular cause-effect structure. So theories of consciousness may only require certain pivotal properties to be shared, and we'll call that pivotal equivalence. And so if we put that in the picture and then see what we end up with, we end up with a picture like this. We start off with system A, and we have an existence proof of that. We humans are conscious. And from that, we determine certain pivotal properties that are associated with every critical level of description that we talked about, these 5 levels of description. And if we're at the first level of description, these pivotal properties will be captured by the sort of a behavioral test, like a consciousness Turing test. If we're at the second level, this computational functional description, if that's the critical level for consciousness, then these pivotal properties would be captured by things like the higher order thought theory or global workspace, or an algorithmic type of predictive processing, or an attention schema theory. And then at the third level, the pivotal properties will be captured by a particular cause-effect structure, or a particular, well, I'm actually saying that an active inference beautiful loop theory, if it's instantiated by a cause-effect structure, that would also be at this third level. And at the fourth level, at this full causal embodied life processes, this would be things like an active inference beast machine theory, or 4E cognition functionalism, or functional biopsychism. Remember, functionalism is not the same as computational functionalism. And if the critical level were in fact at the microphysical level, you could still have pivotal properties which are specific, like a particular electromagnetic field, or a particular way that that microtubules collapse the wave function, or some other biophysical pivotal properties. And now, if we have shared pivotal properties, then we don't have a proof of consciousness. What we have is an increased credence of consciousness. So this is the basic conceptual idea, that how we can, in principle, think about all our theories of consciousness, extract what the pivotal properties are, and think about what the critical level for consciousness is, and then figure out the credence for having a conscious AI. Now, so you might then say, well, okay, great. You've got all these, descriptions, critical levels, and pivotal properties. What's the right one? What is the critical level? What the right credences are? Well, I'll put my money where my mouth is, and I will tell you my credences today. Okay. So I don't really think that the input-output behavioral black box is right. I think just acting and behaving as if you're in a conscious way, I think is not going to work out. Personally, I think that the highest credence that I have has actually shifted. Probably, if you ask me last year, I might have been more of a computational functionalist, but I've actually shifted to becoming, for the fact that the cause-effect structure is very important. And I'll tell you why. The reason why is because the signature of consciousness is essentially this reflexivity, this inherent feedback loop. Of course, that's what's at the heart of our active inference beautiful loop theory. And that actually requires causal description. It may not be correct or enough to simply simulate this kind of feedback, but I'm not that sure. And I think that the computational functional description is also pretty high at 20%, 35% for the cause-effect structure. But I'm also actually surprisingly second highest. This surprised me that I came to this view, which is that embodiment and actually a full causal description actually being embedded into the action perception causal loop of our organism and environment, that causal feedback loop and the causal mechanisms of metabolism and allostasis, I think could be very important. We're so brain-centric nowadays. And maybe consciousness is a lot richer. And I'm sort of also influenced by Michael Levin's work as well as Anil. And then finally, this microphysical level. Could it be that, in fact, we really need, substrate-dependent properties like the electromagnetic field? Maybe. In fact, I have a higher credence for that than I do of behaviorism. Okay, so finally, this is the last slide. So finally, what does this mean for current AI? In other words, does current AI have these pivotal properties? And what would be required to actually have these pivotal properties if current AI doesn't have them? Well, the first one, let's take this input-output black box description, this behaviorist level. Well, actually, oddly enough, this is the only one where we have a few positive Garland test results. Famously, Blake Lemoine at Google actually was convinced that he was dealing with a conscious AI when he was working on a large language model. It's now a couple of years ago. But I think most people don't pass. I mean, there aren't a lot of positive Garland tests yet. But here's my prediction. There will be increasing amounts of public belief in consciousness based on purely behavioral criteria of not just language, but other input-output modalities, as the technology develops along current architectural trajectories. So whilst I don't think this is the right level, this is the critical level for consciousness, my prediction is that everyone's going to think we have consciousness because people are kind of assuming that maybe this top level is the critical level without thinking about it, sort of pre-theoretically just assuming that that's the level. The second level is computational functionalism. Well, does current AI have these pivotal properties? Not many currently. There are some signs, and if you read the Butlin and al. Paper that tries to say how some features of current models have some early signs of these architectural features, but not a lot. But here's, again, something that I talked about, I think about a year ago when I gave a talk, which is that current progress towards AGI will in fact lead to more explicit incorporation of features, pivotal properties like having a global workspace, like having a generative world model, like having metacognition, like having meta-attention, and a self model. So actually, I think that whilst we don't currently have a lot of pivotal properties on the computational functional description layer, we will increasingly have more pivotal properties here. The third level is the cause-effect structure. And current AI doesn't have these kind of cause-effect structure. And there's a reason for that, which is that to have these properties, we would need a fundamental revision away from the kind of serial processing von Neumann architecture. So all computer architecture basically based on this serial von Neumann, collecting in the instructions and doing things and, one by one in a kind of feed-forward way. And current architecture doesn't have these inherent causal feedback loops. For that, we would need a completely different type of more neuromorphic architecture. And so we don't have that at the moment, but maybe we'll get that one day. Maybe someone will try it out. The fourth level, which is this full causal embodied life processes, we don't have that at the moment. But again, we might start getting more of that as we get more physical embodiment, for example, in robotics or other kinds of embodiment, like really genuine interaction with the world by palpating the world, not necessarily totally physically, perhaps through APIs and other ways. But we could have some sort of causal interaction with the environment and some sort of and these systems may actually end up being able to somehow keep themselves going by actively resisting the second law of thermodynamics, by actually doing allostasis through some sort of active inference. And finally, the microphysical layer. Well, no, we don't have any of these pivotal properties like electromagnetic fields or microtubules or organic chemistry going on in current computers. And, you know, that would require a completely different type of sort of replicative Android type emulation systems. So that is the basic way that this kind of critical level theory can really help us think about, could AI be conscious now? The answer is almost certainly not. Might it become conscious? Probably not, but maybe architectural changes could increase the credence of AI becoming conscious. Thank you.
Wow, no, it's a bit bright, isn't it? A bit bright. I think we can do with this.
Okay.
What a tour de force. Amazing. And the fivefold way, as I predicted, you now see it in all its glory. I will take my prerogative and ask you the first question.
Okay.
You know, I'll move over to the side so that everybody can see you online. As you know, I'm not so interested in consciousness. I'm more interested in emotion and in flourishing.
Yeah.
And I'd like for you to maybe speculate about how this works. You know, what are the chances of AI in terms of the fivefold way becoming flourishing? And do you need to be conscious to be flourishing? I think there are pivotal and important questions there.
Okay, great. So I'm also super interested in flourishing, and I think that conscious experience is required for flourishing to be important, to be meaningful. So for genuine flourishing, we need some sort of conscious experience. So, and that conscious experience must have positive valence, some sort of emotional systems. And I think that this is, you're absolutely right, it's the sort of elephant in the room, which I didn't talk about, which is we're talking about consciousness and AI who are going to be so smart. Well, they could be super conscious and they could really have a lot of suffering. And we could be morally implicated in causing that suffering. So this is a very, very important question. So one of the reasons why consciousness is particularly important is because I think it's a prerequisite to actually have any feeling states, any positive or negative feeling states. So yeah, I agree with you. And if we ever do get conscious systems, or even human machine hybrid conscious systems, which could be possible, it's very important that we make sure that we don't mess up and cause a huge amount of suffering.
Well, there's a real interesting question there, but I'm sure there are more questions in the room and maybe online. I'll just check the online, but there's a question here first.
Yeah.
So thank you for the talk. This was amazingly illuminating and pulling together a lot of different things. So it was really great to watch and listen to. I have a few questions about this sort of framework. First one, I'm thinking about is this sort of based on similarity between existing conscious systems, and do you kind of need like, is that a necessary criterion? Like, could you allow for diversity of consciousness, a consciousness which is a different way of being implemented, or a different way of working?
Yeah.
To the current AI.
I think that's a great question, right?
Conscious creatures we have.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So the question is really, you know, are we being almost too anthropocentric in kind of our consciousness thinking? So what we're doing, because we kind of only have an existence proof of consciousness, you know, us mainly and other species, you know, down the phylogenetic chain. We don't know what it's like to be some of them, any of them, in fact, apart from us. You know, you might think, well, we're kind of just sort of copying, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to infer what is it about our system that actually gives this magic dust of consciousness? What are the pivotal properties? But those pivotal properties can be instantiated in radically different ways in an artificial system. So I don't think it actually means we're going to have human-like consciousness. In fact, if we ever do get consciousness, most likely to be very different. I mean, what is it like to be a bat? Probably be more difficult to figure out what it's like to be an AI, maybe. So the idea is that I think the idea is that it's about the way the properties are expressed. There's no limitation on that. But we can only guess at what those properties are by looking at humans and then trying to figure out what the right level of description. And I've argued that, for example, the causal level is particularly important, that somehow also that you don't have to go all the way down to the physical substrate, that there's some sort of functional, not necessarily computational functional, but functional level that is important, that where we can abstract from some of the details of the physical instantiation. And if we can figure out those functional properties, they can be instantiated, operationalized in almost unimaginable ways in AIs.
I'll let ours ask.
Yeah, great. Anyone else?
So I have a bunch.
Are there any questions online?
Yeah, I have a bunch.
Anil, we can't hear you. But maybe,
Well, you have to.
turn off
maybe-
your sound.
Wait, hold on.
Hold on a minute.
Let me.
Oh, yeah. We better if you turn it on.
Actually,
you-
Anil, your
I'm not
your mic
muted.
didn't work before either.
Yeah, but that's not my fault.
Because we don't have sound here.
Ah, wait a second.
Your sound.
Sorry,
My sound.
I have turned off my sound.
Say something?
Hello.
No.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
The other folks on online can hear me.
So I just need to.
If only we had a
Wait,
conscious system.
I'm gonna stop
will.
sharing, and then. How do I? How do I put my sound?
Hold on. We got sound here.
Hello. Can you
Yes,
hear me now?
Anil.
Hey, you can hear me. Thanks, Shamil.
All right.
That's super interesting. I'm so happy you agree with me on most things. Not everything, obviously. Just like there's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on. I mean, maybe two of them we can do later on, but one of them was just back to your beautiful sort of landscape classification of all the different approaches, the metaphysical and the theoretical and so on. I had one minor quibble there with how you were dealing with the biological things. Like there's this sort of the distinction between biopsychism and biological naturalism is super important, at least for me. And you kind of chucked beast machine ideas in the biopsychism where it really isn't. It's biological naturalism, the claim that life in some non-carbon chauvinistic form might be necessary, but is not sufficient for consciousness to be there. So that's it's just important thing. And I think that definition of biological naturalism is a bit odd. I mean, cell means something slightly different from it than how I've been using it. But that's one small thing. Also, it's like when you put David Ma's framework back up, that was really thought-provoking for me because it doesn't work in so many ways now, right? It doesn't work. Firstly, because it's sort of it's taking a computational algorithmic implementation, but one reason that doesn't work is it assumes there's an algorithm for every computation.
Yeah.
There isn't, right? There are many more definitions of computation from Gualtiero Piccinini and so on, some of which are non-algorithmic. So and I think this is a prelude to I guess what is the question, which is, and this is something I struggled with when I was writing my long paper on a similar kind of thing, really trying to lay out the landscape, is that I'm not sure if these hierarchies really work. So your last slide, which is very nice, was sort of looking at the levels of indiscernibility and where you put your credence and so on. But you were still sort of organizing things in this hierarchy, moving away from complete microphysical equivalence, all the way up to computational functionalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know, I'm never sure that you can decompose these things in this strictly hierarchical way. Like, IIT, for instance, is that really more abstract than something like the embodied cognition approaches? I don't know, it's making different claims. And just sort of related to that, and I'll stop, is that when you were talking about how you assign these credences and you're saying there's like pivotal properties that come from the theories. Now, the
Yeah.
big problem with that is that most theories of consciousness, especially most of the scientific biocategorization theories of consciousness, are descriptive. They very rarely, with the exception of IIT, specify necessary or sufficient conditions. And that, they'll whiffle waffle around it, but that wasn't how they came about. So given that they're only descriptive, it's hard for me to understand what you mean by pivotal. Pivotal based on what? Pivotal based on the presence of a whole load of background conditions which remain unspecified.
Right. Okay. Actually, Anil, like, first of all, like, let me go through some of them that I can remember. First of all, I really take the point on the distinction between biopsychism and the beast machine theory. I think that's a really fair point. And I shouldn't have lumped them together. I should I should
All right.
do more work
I'll
there. The second point on this kind of coarse graining and trying to work out these levels. Well, that's the reason I had to do so much theoretical work on this kind of supervenience and coarse graining and stuff like that is because I had the same concern as you, which is that these levels only work if we can genuinely show that there is a many-to-one mapping. And that's why if there's a weakness, now I'm kind of going into where I think I'm weak, and you already figured it out, which is that in the level 2, which is this full causal embodied life processes layer, it's probably a lot richer and more substantial because it effectively has to have a cause-effect structure over all life processes. So it's like IIT on steroids down into the body and into the action perception loop. So it's a lot richer in a way. And the reason I had to do that is because I have to make sure that it supervenes. And so I do take the point that this, it's a good point to make that actually that layer 2 is very, very rich and probably is it's extremely rich, except that we're sort of rescued by the pivotal properties that are required. Now, then that brings me to the final point that you make, which is, where do these pivotal properties come? And I think this is a good point, which is I'm effectively doing some sort of inferring what the pivotal properties are. But I think you're right that, we need to have a much more fleshed out way in terms of like actually making sure that they're necessary and sufficient conditions and that they actually line up to the particular coarse grained description that I'm making. So I would say that this talk is the beginning of a sketch of a much more detailed theory, which is going to be very difficult. And luckily I've got Fernando and others to help me.
And just say one more thing, which is something I really liked about the talk, and that I've learned from it is I like the way that you use the coarse graining to sort of, in my mind, sort of really justify a non-computational functionalism. So, you've got, because functionalism more broadly is, as you say, it's sort of saying that consciousness is a property of the internal functional organization of a system, which include its causal organization as well. And not only is the distinction between functionalism and computational functionalism often ignored or elided, but then there's a lot of confusion about what could be non-computational functions, what would they consist in? And so showing that you have these, as in the work that I've been lucky to work on a little bit with Pedro and Fernando, we have these at least under a PID, which is problematic, but at least under that you have things that you can say are causal at this these coarse-grained levels. The issue, of course, is there's no canonical PID. So it's very hard to give, if you're ascribing macro causal powers on the basis of partial information decompositions, it's hard to give them the same ontological heft because there's no canonical partial information decomposition. This has always been the weakness of that particular approach, even though conceptually it's appealing.
Yeah, I mean, look, figuring out the right cause-effect structure, right causal structure is still a work in progress. I'm much less confident, than the IIT folks purport to be. I mean, they're actually less confident anyway because they're on their 4th version. So clearly, you can't be
Maybe
that.
they're more confident now. Maybe they're getting there to maximum confidence.
But the basic idea is that, look, there's something in this causal power that is important. Exactly how to figure it out, there are different proposals. Yeah. So lots of work to do. As I said, as Morten said at the beginning, I get the cop-out card because like I'm partly a philosopher, so I can do that. But philosopher, yeah, but a philosopher, steeped in the computational side.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think in the interest of time and we need more food and coffee and chocolates, I think we should thank Shamil for a wonderful talk and then return downstairs. And thank you online.